This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this episode 972 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. The Late Round Prospect Guide, it's available for pre-order right now. I know I've mentioned this on previous episodes, but this year's guide has even more detail and more information than ever before. You get info on everything that goes into my prospect and year 2 models. You get profiles for every running back and wide receiver who are going to be at this year's combine. You get year 2 profiles for about 40 second-year running backs and wide receivers. And I've added what I'm calling categories to the model this year that help categorize players into different buckets depending on their overall scores in both the ZAP model and the year 2 model. I'm putting a lot of work into this. I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. You can pre-order it right now over on lateround.com for $14.99. On March 10th when it launches, that price is going to go up by $5. And then also, even though fantasy football season's over, is it actually over? Over on Underdog right now, you can enter drafts for the 2025 season. If you know prospects well, if you have a good grasp on free agency, you can really have an edge on your competition. If you want to check it out, head to underdogfantasy.com and sign up. And when you do, use promo code LATEROUND to get up to $1,000 in bonus cash. That's underdogfantasy.com. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from a handle that I can't pronounce, but it simply says, is Ja'Lynn Polk droppable in Dynasty? So as I said at the top, the Late Round Prospect Guide has year 2 profiles in it, or guys who just finished their rookie season. That model attempts to forecast how well a player is going to perform in year 2 or year 3 of their NFL career. It takes a player's prospect score, it looks at a bunch of metrics from their first year in the NFL, and it spits out a year 2 score. Now, like I also said at the top, I've now got these categories that the model puts players into based on their score. There are 6 categories. You've got the elite producers at the top. Then it's the weekly starters. Then flex plays, then bench warmers, then waiver wire ads, and then finally, there's dart throws. Elite producers are for the very best players of the position. There haven't been many of them since 2011 when the model dates back to. Ja'Lynn Polk is currently being listed as a waiver wire ad because his year 2 score is 69.8. It's really, really not great. And that's driven by some really, really bad metrics in year 1. Unsurprisingly, my write-up for Polk in the year 2 profile section, it's not favorable. Polk had a 0.35 yards per route run rate last year. Honestly, guys, I can't even explain how bad that is. I mean, I can try, but it's really, really horrific. Since 2011, no rookie wide receiver with 200 or more routes run had a yards per route run that low. And only 3 other players within that parameter have been that bad, not just rookies, all wide receivers since 2011. Ja'Lynn Polk had 87 receiving yards on 252 routes. The only thing that's keeping him elevated in the year 2 model is his prospect score from the ZAP model. That ZAP score gets less weight at wide receiver in the year 2 model than it does at running back. But it still matters. But I doubt it's going to really matter that much for Ja'Lynn Polk. The odds that he becomes something significant in fantasy football are really, really slim. Like, even by giving him the benefit of the doubt and using that prospect score to boost his year 2 score, he's in the waiver wire ad category, like I said. And only 1% of waiver wire ad players historically, or since 2011, have scored 14 or more PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3. Only 6.7% of them have even gotten over 10 PPR points per game. Anything below the bench warmer category, so waiver wire ads and dart throws, they suck. They generally don't do much for your fantasy team. In shallow dynasty leagues, I actually could see a scenario where Ja'Lynn Polk can be dropped. Like, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of FFPC teams where he's dropped. I would probably still try to hold on just because his prospect score was at least average, but he wasn't like a can't miss prospect. He just wasn't horrible in my eyes. And there currently is opportunity there in New England, especially with a new coaching staff. At least the surroundings and the circumstances, they are changing a little bit for Ja'Lynn Polk. If that wasn't happening, he would be an easy drop in my eyes. So I would try to hold, but yeah, things are not looking good for him. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @UtewitFace. It says, after making the mistake of ranking Saquon Barkley too low in 2024, why are professional fantasy analysts willing to make the exact same mistake with Christian McCaffrey in 2025? It seems analysts fall prey to recency bias just as much as non-analysts. So I haven't done my rankings for 2025 yet. I haven't built projections yet. So I won't be able to be super definitive with my stance on CMC for 2025. But I do think that last point that you made here is definitely correct. It's human nature to fall victim to something like recency bias. I don't think fantasy analysts are some exception. We're all human. But regarding your question, it's obviously very early. Right now over on Underdog, CMC is going in a pretty similar spot that Saquon Barkley went in last year. So that's probably where this question or kind of statement is stemming from. I just wanted to say that I don't think this is a one-to-one situation and scenario. Ask why Christian McCaffrey is being drafted later this year than he was last year. It's because he had a really scary injury to start the year, and then he got hurt again in season. And the 49ers aren't necessarily in as good of a spot this year as they were last year. And he's another year older. He's going to be 29 at the start of the season. Saquon Barkley was younger this past year. And with Saquon last year, people were fading him because they were worried about touchdown equity. They were worried about the tush push. They didn't think that Saquon was as elite of a running back because his advanced metrics weren't amazing with the Giants. Now, I'm not saying I agreed or disagreed with that. I'm saying that's why people were fading him. That's why his ADP was where it was at. So to me, this really is not the same situation. It's similar from the perspective that their ADPs are similar. They both have broken fantasy football before, and they're coming off seasons where they kind of disappointed. But Barkley played 14 games for the Giants in 2023. CMC had that really unclear injury. He wasn't his special self from a fantasy perspective in limited time, and then he got hurt again. I don't necessarily think it's recency bias. It's just people understanding that we're dealing with a 29-year-old running back who could be wearing down a little bit. Again, that's not really a take on Christian McCaffrey. I don't have that formulated yet. I want to talk to some doctors too. But I at least wanted to say that sometimes you can get yourself into trouble when you make loose connections like this. I think there's a lot more to it, personally. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @AmaniBurger. It says, during prospect season, there's lots of talk about day 2 capital, but are rounds 2 and 3 really that close to each other in terms of hit rate to warrant being discussed as one bucket? So I often reference day 1, day 2, day 3. But I'm doing it as a broad generalization. A player who gets selected 35th overall is not the same as a player who gets drafted 100th overall. I wouldn't even think about it in rounds either. Just think about it in terms of raw, straight up pick. That's what my prospect model does. And yes, draft capital matters less and less as you get through the draft. I don't care much about the difference between a 6th rounder and a 7th rounder. I do compared to an undrafted player, but there's less meaning with draft capital when you get that late. But here's some data for you. The ZAP model looks at best 2 seasons across the first 3 years of a player's career. But to make this simple, I'll just find the number of players to hit certain thresholds and max season PPR points per game during their first 3 years in the league. Let me just run through some examples at running back and wide receiver. From 2011 through 2022, I'm not going to include running backs who haven't had an opportunity to play 3 years in the league. During that time period, we've had the exact same number of second-round running backs as we have players drafted between pick 65 and pick 101. So guys drafted in the top 100. There were 33 running backs taken in that time frame in round 2, and there were 33 between picks 65 and 100. Of the players drafted in round 2, 14 of them had a season with 14 or more PPR points per game during their first 3 years in the league. That's a minimum 8 games played. That number is 9 when looking at the other day 2 picks. And the ceiling outcomes are way different. We've had 11 of the round 2 running backs get 16 or more PPR points per game across their first 3 years in the league. Only 5 of them of the other group got there. That's a huge discrepancy. Now, the numbers aren't quite as dramatic at wide receiver. The ceiling outcomes are actually pretty similar throughout, but we get much better floors from round 2 wide receivers. Much more wide receiver 2 type seasons. So maybe I shouldn't even call that a floor. There's a difference though between day 1 picks too. It's not just day 2 picks. An early first rounder is much different than a late first rounder. It's just a general way to talk about draft capital. We always need to look at the actual pick to determine the exact value. This next question is from Significant Otter on Blue Sky. It says, I have Marshawn Lloyd on one of my dynasty teams, and it got me thinking. Generally speaking, how do you evaluate guys who are coming into year 2 with mid to late draft capital that didn't really get a good sample size in year 1 due to injury? So it's a fair question that a lot of people have. And my simple answer is that it depends. I care a lot more if that player was a high-end prospect. If he wasn't, like a Marshawn Lloyd, then we know the team may have a shorter leash and not be patient enough for that player to get healthy. Especially at running back. Availability matters. It's a big deal to a team and a coaching staff for that running back to be able to play. And if Marshawn Lloyd saw injury after injury last year, there's no doubt that had some negative impact on his standing with the team. Look at what happened with Kendre Miller down in New Orleans. But more importantly, just look at history. This is directly from the Late Round Prospect Guide. I've got the year 2 profiles all written because there's a lot of content in this thing. Quote, the year 2 model has seen 5 other running backs aside from Lloyd enter their careers with a ZAP score in the 70s and exit their rookie season with a score that was 20 plus points below said ZAP score. Each one of those running backs ended up busting. So Marshawn Lloyd had a ZAP score, and then that score took a 20 plus point hit with his year 2 score. We don't see running backs really overcome that. Now we can make excuses and say that it was all injury related. But the unfortunate side to football is that injuries often do derail careers. Now, I'm not saying that Marshawn Lloyd's career is over. I just mean what his possible ceiling might look like. Like, let's just take this a step further. We know that a player like Lloyd, when his ZAP score to his year 2 score drops by a whole lot, that's a huge, huge red flag. But let's just look at all running backs in the year 2 model who had good prospect scores, let's say above 70, which is where Marshawn Lloyd was, who then played fewer than 3 games as rookies. Mikel LaShore, Ryan Williams, Marcus Lattimore, Jerry McNichols, Darius Geis, Bryce Love, and Travis Etienne. The only guy to hit out of that group was Etienne. And guess what? His team invested in him. He had a ZAP score of almost 98. Marshawn Lloyd's was 78. Now, I can be more lenient when we're talking really good prospects, because really good prospects are number 1, better at the game. But number 2, they've got more of a team commitment. That latter piece is obviously more of a guess, but I do think it is logical. So with Marshawn Lloyd, it's really hard to be bullish. The last question this week is from Felix on Blue Sky. It says, you said Trey Benson is one of your sells. How does he compare to Chase Brown last offseason? Is there a chance that come draft season, Connor and Benson are both mid-round ADP, and Benson becomes a good, ambiguous running back pick? I don't think those two situations are similar at all. Now, I can tell you that Brown had a worse year 2 score in that year 2 model compared to Benson. That's because Brown didn't do a ton as a rookie, and he wasn't as strong of a prospect compared to Benson, largely due to draft capital. Brown landed in the bench warmer category, so he's going to be a hit from that category, which we rarely see in the year 2 model. Trey Benson's currently in the flex play category, which is one up from that. But Benson saw his prospect score to year 2 score drop year over year. Chase Brown saw that rise. His prospect score to his year 2 score got better. And the competition around Benson, it's much different than what Chase Brown faced last year. Brown had a free agent in Zach Moss to compete with. We had no idea if Moss was even good, let alone if he would work in that Cincinnati offense. Benson has James Conner to compete with. Conner's not only been a really good back, but we have evidence of him working in this offensive system with this team and with this coaching staff. In order for a true ambiguous backfield situation to occur, we'd need the 2 running backs to be close in ADP. And if you look at best ball drafts happening over at Underdog, Conner's getting selected 6 to 7 rounds earlier than Trey Benson. And if nothing major happens, I'd imagine we're going to see something similar with season-long drafts over the summer. But the 2 guys look pretty different in the models. They were different prospects, getting selected in different areas of the draft. And they have had different journeys from year 1 to year 2. Now, it's only February, a lot can change. But this all plays into what I was saying before. If we're pretty convinced that James Conner is going to play a decent-sized role in 2025, which I think it's fair to say that he will, then we don't need to force it with Trey Benson. Probability is not on his side based on his prospect score and how he performed as a rookie, regardless of the competition that he faced. I don't know why we need to force it with Benson and not some of the other backup running backs across the league. That's why Benson's a sell. And I don't currently see it as a similar situation as what Chase Brown had last year. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Remember to pre-order that prospect guide over on lateround.com. Otherwise, everyone, enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you next week.